You're listening to Dead Strange, the podcast where I'll be delving into bizarre cases from across the globe. I am your host, Sophie Ray. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the harrowing case of Mark Kilroy. For many Americans, spring break is an integral part of one's young adulthood, and it has remained that way since the 1930s. Many view the week-long holiday as a type of party tradition, a rite of passage if you will, for students all across the United States. Come the springtime, thousands of young Americans flock together, armed with plenty of booze, bathing suits, and questionable romantic morals. While iconic American locations such as Daytona Beach in the Sunshine State remain a firm favourite with spring breakers, venturing out to more tropical locations has become popular in recent years. The Caribbean islands of Jamaica and the Bahamas now receive their fair share of holidaymakers, as well as resort towns across the border in Mexico. Throughout the months of March and April, these places are sure to be crawling with partygoers, taking advantage of the busy nightlife scene and fun atmosphere. And people are sure to make full use of the country's lax drinking laws. This holiday is usually associated with partying, excessive drinking, and making memories with your closest friends. It's supposed to be a carefree vacation where you can find yourself far removed from any horrors of the real world. For a few weeks, spring break promises that you can forget all about your troubles and have the best time of your life. It was springtime in 1989, and 21-year-old University of Austin student Mark Kilroy was planning on doing exactly that. Originally born in Chicago, Mark's parents moved to the small city of Santa Fe in Galveston County, Texas, soon after he was born. The predominantly Catholic city of Santa Fe is a simple place, with its single main street and one high school. With its traditional small-town community and religious values, the Kilroys certainly thought it was a great place to call home. Mark's father Jim worked hard as a chemical engineer, and his mum Helen volunteered as a paramedic. The couple gave birth to Mark's younger brother Keith 2 years after their move, and the family put down their roots in the city for good. You could often find them attending Our Lady of Lourdes Church in the nearby town of Hitchcock, and they were glad to be a part of such a welcoming, tight-knit neighbourhood. As a teenager, Mark excelled at school and was a proud member of the student council at Santa Fe High School, once ranking 14th out of a class of 210. Though he had no problem with the academic part of his education, his real love was playing sports. He particularly loved to play basketball, baseball, and he even tried his hand at golf. In his free time, he regularly attended Boy Scout meetings, and it seemed he was passionate about learning about the great outdoors. In 1986, Mark graduated high school with honours and decided to enroll at Texas State University before transferring to Tarleton State on a basketball scholarship, where he joined the Lambda Chi fraternity. At some point during his life at Tarleton State, he decided that an athletic scholarship wasn't for him, so he moved to his final university, the University of Texas at Austin. Here, he became a pre-med student and had excellent grades. Though studying hard for his medical college admission test, he still found plenty of time for his Catholic faith, and his father would often find him studying the Bible instead of his college textbooks. Looking back on this fond memory of his eldest son, Jim Kilroy said in an interview, "Mark needed to study, but there's no way I'm going to tell my son to stop reading the Bible." On the 10th of March, Mark's best friend Bradley Moore had finally finished with exams at Texas A&M University. He drove to Austin to pick up Mark, and the two of them then drove back to their hometown of Santa Fe, where they picked up two more childhood friends of theirs, Bill Huddleston and Brent Martin. All four were lifelong friends and extremely close. The boys all shared the same passion for sports, and you could usually find them playing baseball together as kids. They talked almost daily before university life undoubtedly hindered their meetups. But they were now free from the burdens of exams and lengthy assignments, and they finally had the opportunity to have a much-needed catch-up. Hoping to make memories that lasted a lifetime, they decided to take a trip to the resort town of South Padre Island in Cameron County, Texas. After a long 9-hour road trip through thick fog, the group finally arrived shortly before midnight. The resort has been a popular place for spring breakers since the 1980s, as a tourism boom helped it get back on its feet after the devastating effect of Hurricane Bellower in 1967. South Padre Island is no stranger to storms and is regularly battered with hurricanes, torrential rains, and high winds. Luckily for the town's economy, the possibility of a freak storm doesn't deter its tourists too much at all, as it is a popular place for many once-in-a-lifetime activities, such as dolphin watching, water sports, and an elite fishing tournament which is hosted annually, with a hefty prize of $250,000. Its safety and relatively low crime rate are reflected in its massive visitors, with thousands of people travelling there every year, from young families to teens looking to party. It seemed then that the four friends had certainly picked the perfect location to enjoy their spring break. Seeing as though it was the dead of night when they arrived, and the group were understandably groggy from their long journey, the four lads decided they'd formally check in at their hotel in the morning. They were staying at the Sheraton Resort, a place that still remains an extremely sought-after hotel to stay at. With its on-the-beach location and chilled atmosphere, Mark and his friends figured it would be the perfect place to relax after hours of day drinking and partying. As morning broke and they felt fully refreshed, they headed over to the beach to see what activities they could find. After a while, Mark thought it would be a good idea to phone his parents back home, letting them know he was safe and sound in the South Texas sunshine. Relieved to hear his voice, his parents must have felt a weight lift off their shoulders, knowing their son was okay. At this time of the year, not many people were on the beach, as it was still quite early in the spring break season. Nevertheless, the boys soon met with some girls, and they all partied until the early hours of the morning. As the weekend came the following day, masses of students were arriving at the resort, and the atmosphere became alive as music and people ensured that the beachfront became a loud hive of activity. The next morning, Mark and his friends discussed their plans for the day, and a daily routine for the coming days was more or less established. They started their day off sunbathing on the beach before the afternoon sun got too hot, and then they all headed over to eagerly watch the Miss Tanline contest, likely engaging in boyish banter as they watched dozens of scantily clad women strut their stuff in tiny bikinis. You can usually find this classic spring break tradition happening daily on South Padre Island, and sure enough, the group of friends began to thoroughly enjoy themselves. After the contest was over, Mark became sleepy and headed back to his room for a well-deserved rest. Sometime later, Mark and his group were ready to party all over again, so they decided to take a trip down to Mexico. The friends had been talking about visiting the town of Matamoros since the previous year, and often had late-night phone calls with one another, discussing all the great things the place had to offer. From cheap beer to plenty of single girls, the group were understandably excited to visit. With Bradley Moore at the wheel, they first stopped at a Sonic restaurant in Port Isabel, where they grabbed some lunch. After ordering their fast food at the drive-thru, they met some female students from the University of Kansas, and both groups of students were thrilled to discover that they were planning on driving to the same town. Sharing common interests and intentions, the revellers made fast friends with one another and thought it best that they stick together. After all, the border town of Matamoros is usually extremely busy with tourists, and it would be easy to become lost amongst the bustling crowds. With Bradley Moore leading the way, the girls followed, and they parked their cars near the Gateway International Bridge. They then crossed the border over to Mexico on foot, and the decision to do so would arguably haunt Mark's friends forever. The pleasure seekers did not know it yet, but stalking the shadows of the Mexican town of Matamoros was one of the most depraved individuals in the country's history. Despite its beauty and rich culture, Mexico has an infamously dark history, one that is extensive and shocking. The infamous Mexican cartels now dominate the country's crime statistics, with gang-related incidences being a daily occurrence in some areas. The huge influence of the cartels has a devastating domino-like effect on the country's people, and whether or not its poorest residents can put food on the table can often depend on the success of their local cartel. In a vicious cycle, those born into extreme poverty are forced to work for these dangerous gangs, as it may be the only way they can survive. It goes without saying that in many small towns stricken by poverty, the gangs truly rule the streets. One of Mexico's oldest criminal groups goes by the name of the Gulf Cartel, and its roots can be traced to as far back as the 1980s. Operating in territory close to the US-Mexico border, primarily in the border state of Tamaulipas, the gang leaders discovered it was relatively easy for them to smuggle huge quantities of cocaine and marijuana into the USA, as the only thing separating them from Texas was the Gateway International Bridge. As they made more of a name for themselves, it's widely believed that they were in association with the cartels of Colombia. With gangs as big as these, it isn't uncommon for them to hold a great deal of influence over politicians and police officers, and it only takes a bribe for a corrupt state official to turn a blind eye, no matter how atrocious the crime. For the many hardcore gangsters of Mexico, religion plays a massive part in their daily lives and how they operate. Religion in Mexico as a whole is a complex matter, and a huge piece of it was born from a fusion of traditional Catholic ideologies and ancient native traditions. Witchcraft, stemming from the country's Aztec heritage, is still visible, and if you were to take a trip to any old marketplace, you could see it for yourself. Amongst the tourist-trap stalls selling sombreros and cheesy souvenirs, you're likely to find stalls selling mysterious herbs and spices, strange-looking amulets, and a variety of potions and spells. In many villages, shamans or brujos still operate, practicing their witchcraft, casting spells, and warding off evil spirits with the help of traditional ingredients like garlic and pepper. Blissfully unaware of the country's preoccupation with black magic, Mark Kilroy and his friends were instead entranced by the town's busy party scene and cheap alcohol. Mark's crew and the girls from Kansas spent their evening partying at the Sgt. Pepper nightclub, and they had such a good time that when they poured out of the club hours later, morning had already broken. The boys bid a final farewell to their new friends from the Midwest, and the two groups parted ways. After returning to the Sheraton and sleeping off their hangovers, the lads were keen to return to the exciting city that was Matamoros. Before they returned, they attended a nearby party at a condo just down the road from their hotel. Mark was pleasantly surprised to see one of his old fraternity brothers from Tarleton State at the party, and the two old friends sat drinking for a few hours, laughing and joking about the good old days of being a freshman. Later on in the evening, and over in the town of Matamoros, thousands of tourists were now forming lines outside the many nightclubs, bars and restaurants. Arriving late to the party, Mark and his friends thought it wise to pick the place with the shortest queue. After all, they didn't really care where they ended up, so long as the drinks were flowing and the music was loud. When they finally entered the Los Sombreros Club, they were far from disappointed. The club was unlike anything the boys had ever experienced back in their quiet hometown of Santa Fe, and they stayed for a few drinks. Well on into the night, the group fancied a change of scenery, and it was at this point that they headed over to the Hard Rock Cafe, which was just across the street. The energy in this bar was much different, and rowdy crowds of drunken college kids were throwing beer bottles from the upstairs balcony. Amidst the chaos, Mark became separated from his friends, but he wasn't in any danger at this point. He had met up with a few girls and was seen flirting happily well into the night. By 2 a.m, it was safe to say that the majority of people lining the main street of Alvaro Obregón were very, very drunk. Bill Huddleston was the first to suggest that they should all regroup and head back to the Sheraton. Outside the club, Bill, Bradley and Brent looked over to see where Mark was. The three boys grinned knowingly to one another after they spotted Mark leaning casually against a car, flirting with one of the girls who's competed in the Miss Tanline contest the previous day. While they waited for Mark, Bradley and Brent headed over to Garcia's, a restaurant store, to pick up some food for the long walk back across the bridge. Seeing that his childhood friend was waiting for him to stop romancing the girl, Mark waved her goodbye and waited for an amused Bill Huddleston to catch up to him. He was just meters away down the street, but a large mob of tourists all walking back to cross the border made it hard for the pair to keep a close eye on one another. After a night of drinking copious amounts of alcohol, the urge to urinate hit Bill suddenly, so he darted discreetly down a nearby alleyway. By the time Bill had finished and emerged from the dark alley, Mark had disappeared. Unsure what to do, Bill waited until Brent and Bradley had returned from the store to see if maybe Mark had bumped into them. His worst fears were confirmed when they confirmed that he hadn't. The friends searched for around 2.5 hours, calling out Mark's name and asking passers-by if they'd seen anyone matching his description. They thought that Mark had become lost in the huge crowds of people who were travelling back over the border. At about 4:30 in the morning, they travelled back over the bridge to where they'd parked the car, but were disheartened to find that Mark was not waiting for them. Helpless and now tired, they returned to the Sheraton Hotel. Here, there was zero sign that Mark had returned to his room. The three got some sleep, all eagerly hoping that their best friend would roll up sometime in the morning, hungover after his solo adventure. However, this could not be further from the truth. The next morning, the three friends looked around for any signs of Mark. With the bed where Mark once lay still empty, his worried friends contacted the police immediately and reported him missing. At first, police officers didn't treat Mark's disappearance with any sense of urgency, as he was one of 60 drunken tourists who had vanished during the spring break of 1989. The majority of which had returned after a few days with few memories of their drink-fueled escapades. Despite the high number of drug-related crimes that often plague the city of Matamoros, Mexican detectives investigating were quietly confident that the young student would turn up safe and well. After all, Mark Kilroy was definitely not the type to become involved in the seedy world of the cartels, as this typical all-American boy had a privileged upbringing, no criminal record, and he certainly didn't have any enemies. He was the last person you'd expect to be the victim of the dangerous gang, often driven by vengeance toward their rivals. In the early days of Mark's disappearance, there was no reason for police to think anything bad had happened at all. Across the border in the US state of Texas, it was a different story altogether. Learning his beloved nephew was missing, Ken Kilroy, a United States Customs officer, voiced his concerns to his colleagues, and a huge police task force was assembled over in Brownsville. With Mark's case now gaining lots of attention with the help of the media, officials in the town of Matamoros began to panic and tried to shift the blame over to Texas in a last-ditch attempt to save their booming spring break economy. In a press conference, they tried to convince swarms of reporters that Mark had already crossed the border back into the US and that they should turn their attention to Brownsville. However, Mark's friends strongly denied that he ever made it across the bridge, and plenty of witnesses were there to back them up. The Mexican authorities' claims were quashed, and they finally started to admit that they had a serious missing persons case on their hands. Back at home in Santa Fe, a shockwave of disbelief swept across the small community. Residents raised money for Mark's family by setting up dozens of yard sales and car washing events. For several weeks, every car's windshield glistened, and tables of various knickknacks were strewn across the front lawns of Santa Fe. And it was all for Mark. Everybody was more than willing to pitch in so that a substantial amount of reward money could be raised. In no time, $15,000 was raised. A group of locals would regularly head to the Rio Grande Valley, led by Mark's parents, and they handed out over 20,000 flyers, trying desperately to get the residents on the South Texan border more involved in the tragic case. Mark hadn't turned up for several days, and the Mexican police strongly believed Mark had been kidnapped, maybe for ransom money. Now sharing this belief with investigators, the Kilroys accepted an invitation to meet with Attorney General Jim Mattox, Texas Governor William Clements, and US Senator Lloyd Bentsen, and the progress of the case was discussed further. The officials told Jim and Helen that they were trying their best to talk with the government over in Tamaulipas. However, they admitted they were having an extremely hard time getting them to cooperate properly. This certainly raised many questions, and the US investigators openly distrusted the state and municipal officers, instead praising the Mexican federal police. The almost deliberate slowness that came from the state instantly made investigators suspicious, and they suspected foul play. In a police force mottled by the shades of corruption and deceit, it was widely believed that Mark's kidnappers had inside contacts working within the police force. On March 26th, Mark's case was nationally broadcast on America's Most Wanted. Despite his face and story reaching millions of homes across America, the highlight only produced a few tips, all of which turned out to be false leads. Though despondent with the slow progress and dead ends that came with the case, police forces on both sides did not lose hope. It was now nearing the 3-week mark since the student had disappeared, seemingly vanishing off the face of the earth, and the investigation was now tightening. Lead detectives surmised that Mark had perhaps been the victim of a drug deal gone wrong, and helicopters and all-terrain vehicles were often deployed to scour the dense scrubland surrounding the state of Tamaulipas, particularly searching along the banks of the Rio Grande. Sadly, it seemed police were now expecting to find human remains rather than a living person. In the search for Mark, the beginning of the end came in the form of a chance encounter. On April 1st, 1989, Mexican police stationed near the border were running routine checks on vehicles, expecting to encounter the usual criminal activities of drug runners and their overlords. Halfway through their shift stationed at the roadblock, a particular vehicle piqued their interest. A red truck raced brazenly through the roadblock, with no thoughts of stopping. Instead of alerting the shady-looking vehicle of their presence, the officers called for backup, and it came in the form of an unmarked vehicle, which swiftly followed the truck along the Mexican federal highway, keeping their distance to avoid any suspicion. If the cocky criminal had spotted them, he showed no signs of it, as he cruised along the highway at a steady speed. Soon, the driver pulled up to a ranch called Rancho Santa Elena, and the unmarked car hid in a nearby road. The ranch was somewhat of a crumbling ruin, with several dilapidated outhouses dotting the grounds. After about 30 minutes of waiting for any movement, the police officers saw the driver re-enter his car and speed off, now heading towards the city. The officers thought this was their moment. They had to make their move and make it fast. Bear in mind that at this point the police officers had no inkling that this suspicious character with his rundown ranch and junky truck had anything to do with the disappearance of Mark Kilroy. As they entered Rancho Santa Elena, they thought they'd hit the jackpot in terms of a huge drugs bust. They found 30 kilos of marijuana and were pretty convinced they were about to put one of the city's biggest drug smugglers away behind bars for a very long time. However, as they investigated the property further, a couple of officers stumbled upon a small shed littered with cigarette butts, cast iron cauldrons and candles, and the colour was said to drain from their faces. This was when lead investigator Juan Benitez intervened, and he called the investigation off, much to the dismay of other detectives. What seems like a rotten old outhouse filled with rubbish was something much more sinister indeed. The Mexican detectives knew that the shed served as a shrine to the devil himself, a work of black magic in its darkest form. A man who firmly believed in superstitions, Benitez was known to protect his office back at the police station with sacred items to ward off evil, and he was quite adamant that nobody should set foot on the property until the dark magic was lifted by a local witch. Although the scenes of spellcasting at the crime scene seemed bizarre to so many, people stood by and watched with respect for the deep religious beliefs ingrained in the Mexican police force. After a few hours of chanting and blessing the sprawling grounds of Rancho Santa Elena, Detective Benitez gave the go-ahead to tear the place to the ground, and officers lay in wait, ready to arrest the owner of the truck. On April 9th, 1989, they arrested a total of 5 people. They were the truck's driver, Serafin Hernandez Garcia, his sadistic gangster uncle Elio, the rancher's caretaker, Domingo Reyes Bustamante, and 2 other gang members, David Valdez and Sergio Martinez. Initially arrested for the large quantity of drugs found on the property, the gang members remained calm as they sat in custody. Deep down, head investigator Benitez knew that something much more sinister was afoot, and he intended to search through the gang's hideout with a fine-tooth comb. Viewing him as the weakest of the 5 detainees, officers interrogated the elderly caretaker for any information about the creepy ranch with its altar to the devil. He cooperated fully, and it seemed he had no part in the gang's activities, other than being their humble housekeeper and groundsman. He confirmed that it was true. The ranch was used by the dangerous Hernandez gang, a group of criminals who had managed to evade the police force of Matamoros for years. He then explained that the ranch had been frequently visited by various higher-up gang members during the week. Detecting some trepidation in the old man's tale, police probed him further. At this point, disturbing items had been found on the property that hinted towards the possibility of human sacrifice. In a dusty old cauldron, police found a dead black cat, and most disturbing of all, a human brain. As more and more details were uncovered about Rancho Santa Elena, so was the identity of the ranch's official owner. That man was Adolfo Constanzo, a Cuban-American drug dealer whose life had always revolved around a deep obsession with religion. When Adolfo was a teenager, his mother would occasionally take him to trips to Haiti, where he was exposed to the fascinating world of Haitian voodoo. From then on, this former Catholic altar boy was hooked on the possibility of achieving higher power through dark magic. When he was around 18 years old, he met a sorcerer who practiced palo, a religion where things like animal sacrifices and the use of real human bones are not uncommon. Adolfo soon became addicted on his newfound religion, and he practiced his craft almost daily. When his mother remarried to a man equally palo-obsessed, the two became close friends and they began a career of drug dealing. After some years, and with the wealth from many a drug deal, Adolfo became more independent, so he moved to Mexico City. Here, he ran a successful business as a sorcerer, and at one point people from all around the city would flock to Adolfo Constanzo to rid them of evil omens or to bring them luck. He ran this witchcraft business with partners Martin Quintana and Jorge Montes, but these two men soon became somewhat obsessed with his grand power and looked to him as more of a leader than as a business partner. Out of the many clients he had acquired over the years, the wealthiest and most eager to pay were the many drug lords of the Mexican cartels. With a lust for violence, they would wait with bated breath as they watched Adolfo slaughter innocent animals for supposed sacrifices. Chickens, goats, snakes, zebras, even lion cubs were not safe from the sadistic hands of the sorcerer, and he convinced his gangster clients that all the blood spilt was sure to bring them good luck and fortune. Before long, he attracted the attention of wealthy state policemen, all of which had fallen into the snares of greed and corruption. The policemen introduced Adolfo to the lucrative trade that existed within narcotics, and the sacrifice-obsessed sorcerer soon became involved with the Hernandez gang of Matamoros. It was revealed that the head of the gang, Elio Hernandez, offered Adolfo half the gang's proceeds from drugs in exchange for supernatural protection for his family of criminals. A deal was made, and the pair developed a mutual respect for one another. As his religion intensified, Adolfo and his associates became known as the narco-Satanists for their dangerous ideologies. They were known to raid graveyards for human bones, which they would add to Adolfo's special cauldron, along with regular animal sacrifices. They all firmly believed that the rituals they were performing granted them the immense wealth and power they had gained from dealing narcotics. In reality, corruption was to blame for their wide success, with many a good police officer far too afraid to take any leads on the gang, out of fear for their life. In 1988, Adolfo and his gang members, now much more like a cult, moved to Rancho Santa Elena, where the violence and crime worsened. It was at this time when Adolfo told his cronies that animal sacrifices were no longer powerful enough, and they needed the souls of innocents to strengthen the connection to the spiritual world. Up to 20 people, most rival gang members, some just innocent tourists, were slaughtered at Rancho Santa Elena to appease the crazed sorcerer's insatiable appetite for murder. He never acted alone though, as second in command to cult leader Adolfo was a woman called Sara Aldrete, a woman who remains one of the most unique criminals in history. For a start, Aldrete was highly independent and earned her high rank almost as soon as she met Adolfo, which is historically unusual for female cult members. In fact, she ordered lower-ranking members to call her La Madrina, or Godmother, and she oversaw the majority of the gang's marijuana and cocaine exports. In addition to this, she would act as the cult's main recruiter, and would show potential members the iconic 1987 movie, The Believers, in order to convince them that human sacrifice was the secret ingredient for lifelong success. Many of the new recruits were young men, enamoured by their new charismatic and confident godmother. It was speculated, though, that Aldrete suffered from a dissociative identity disorder, then just commonly called a split personality, as the other side of her life was a stark contrast to her bizarre role as a cult leader. As the young woman many knew and loved, she was a popular student at Brownsville High School and was described as a straight-A student with a love for sports, and at an impressive 6'1", she towered above the majority of her friends. Despite her academic success, particularly in physical education, her peers thought it was odd she drove an old car and often wore all-black clothing. It's widely believed that during this time of her life, the Mexican-American citizen had developed an affinity for witchcraft. After high school, she completed her degree in physical education at university, and she even became a qualified high school gym teacher. Why exactly this seemingly successful woman had become in the bizarre world of the narco-Satanists is unknown. Now though, leaders Adolfo and Sara were nowhere to be seen. Alarmed by the heavy police presence at the ranch, and probably warned by the many corrupt officers they had in the police force, they fled to a Holiday Inn in Brownsville. For now, all they could do was wait and hoped that the other cult members, now in custody, were loyal enough to keep quiet. However, back at the police station, Serafine Hernandez, the youngest of the gang and the one who had so stupidly led police back to the hideout, shocked everyone by revealing almost every detail about every sordid crime the cult had ever committed. Although one of the first members of the narco-Satanists, Seraphine's role could be likened to that of a mere foot soldier, as he only ever acted under the command of his powerful kingpin uncle. Despite this, he was far from innocent. In fact, he admitted to actively partaking in many ritualistic kidnappings and murders, and he stated that there were more than a dozen bodies buried at Rancho Santa Elena. Shockingly, Serafine was studying towards a law enforcement major at Texas Southmost College. Maybe the young man was attracted to the highly glamorized lifestyle of a double agent, convinced that he could make stacks of cash for both sides. His confessions seemed to pour out of his mouth, and they sounded like something straight from the plot of a bizarre slasher film. Unsurprisingly, the ranch had now become a major crime scene. The caretaker, Domingo Reyes Bustamante, was shown a picture of Mark Kilroy. The old man is said to have grimaced and nodded, confirming that he was indeed brought to the ranch. He later elaborated that he recognised Mark as one of the victims who he had made a breakfast of toast, eggs and water one morning in March. That was all detectives needed, and they were now certain Mark Kilroy had died by the hand of this psychopathic narco-Satanist cult. Upon asking Serafine about Mark Kilroy, he recounted way back to that fateful night of March 13th and told detectives in detail about exactly what had happened. According to him, cult leader Adolfo Constanzo had stated that he needed the brain of an American student for his special cauldron, and he sent Serafine and a few other henchmen out on a mission to find the perfect victim. They cruised the town of Matamoros in their truck for several hours, scoping out all the drunken tourists from across the border. At around 2 a.m, they spotted Mark standing all alone on a crowded street. They approached him and asked him if he needed a ride, knowing that he wouldn't be able to hear them amongst the crowds of tourists. When Mark leaned closer to the vehicle to listen to their question again, he was bundled into the back and the gangsters sped off toward Rancho Santa Elena. About 2 blocks down the road, Mark managed to break free from his kidnappers, and he escaped from the vehicle. He ran as fast as he could, and in that fleeting moment, he might have counted himself lucky to have dodged such a frightening situation. Tragically, a second vehicle driven by the gang's associates soon caught up with him, and he was taken hostage at gunpoint. This time, the dangerous cartel took Mark's athletic build into account and didn't take any chances, so they subdued and handcuffed the terrified student. In their eyes, bringing him back to Rancho Santa Elena was of utmost importance, as their cult leader had specifically asked them to choose a typical white American for the sacrifice, and Mark seemed to fit the bill perfectly, with his mop of golden hair and wide, wholesome smile. As is common with tragic cases such as these, Mark Kilroy was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Interestingly, when under hypnosis therapy earlier on in the case, Bradley Moore recalled that a mystery Hispanic male had approached the group of men hours prior to Mark's disappearance. He remembered that the man was very distinctive, wearing a bright plaid shirt and had a scar across his cheek. According to Bradley, the man approached Mark specifically and asked him if he knew him from somewhere. Suitably intoxicated from a night of drinking, none of the friends remembered exactly what became of this strange encounter. Arriving back at Rancho Santa Elena with their prisoner, the cartel members decided to leave him tied up in the truck overnight. Morning soon broke, and the ranch's caretaker did his best to make Mark a hearty breakfast, possibly knowing that this would be the young man's last ever meal. Mark lay in handcuffs for around 12 hours before sadistic cult leader Adolfo Constanzo turned up at the ranch accompanied by his closest associates. They soon began to march him to a nearby storage cabin in order to complete the ritualistic killing that they viewed as being set in stone. Throughout the night, Mark Kilroy was tortured in unimaginable ways, with Adolfo Constanzo performing various depraved acts on the innocent student. Throughout the hours of the abuse, it was clear that Constanzo was getting immense personal gratification from the so-called important ritual, and he was utterly manic from the power he possessed. As with many cult leaders, he used his religion as a guise to cover up his true intentions as a depraved serial killer. After enduring hours of torture, Mark made a break for the door and managed to get as far as the nearby field. Likely driven by his faith, he was determined to survive. After a short while though, the enraged cult leader caught up to him. Worried that his ritual would be ruined, he raised his machete and struck Mark on the back of the head. Mark tumbled to the ground, dying instantly. In spite of all the horror he had gone through in his final hours, his death came quickly at least, and he was no longer suffering. As he lay lifeless on the floor, the cult members were ordered to remove his brain and boil it. This was to be the final ingredient for Adolfo's special cauldron, and was ultimately the reason for Mark's horrific murder. After their interrogation at the police station, Serafin Hernandez and another cult member, Sergio Martinez, led police to the exact location where the bodies were buried. Handed shovels and picks, they were forced to excavate the ground at gunpoint, and huge swarms of international media teams had a field day filming the shocking event. After a while of digging, news crews from places as far as Japan soon began covering up their faces with masks and handkerchiefs, as the smell of rotting flesh infested the air. As the afternoon sun was setting, 15 bodies now lay on a makeshift tarp, in a scene that will be burned into the minds of the many witnesses forever. When Mark's body was unearthed, it was the easiest one to find, as it was marked by a single piece of wire sticking up from the ground. Both his legs had been removed, and onlookers were horrified to discover that the wire was connected to Mark's spinal column, and the idea was that once his body was decomposed enough, the wire could be simply pulled from the ground with the bones perfectly intact. As the bodies were taken away and the news crews dispersed, the Mexican Federal Police, led by Officer Benitez, sneaked back in the dead of night and burned the evil place to the ground. Watching their ranch get torn to pieces via the screen of a cheap motel TV, Adolfo Constanzo and Sara Aldrete were running out of time. They had to move fast, as their unique appearances made them instantly recognisable. After all, it's not every day that a Satanist with a mullet and a 6'1" witch vacation as a Holiday Inn. The day the bodies were discovered, they fled to a hideout in Mexico City, accompanied by several of their closest cult members. They stayed holed up in their lair, armed with an arsenal of machine guns and tons of cocaine, until the dawn of March 6, 1989. Police stormed the property with an even bigger arsenal of weapons. Adolfo Constanzo, high on cocaine, was livid that the police had found him, and he began firing machine guns at police even though he knew he was outnumbered. Accepting his fate, he turned to his bodyguard, nicknamed El Dubi, and commanded him to complete one last ritualistic killing. Constanzo handed El Dubi the machine gun, stood back and closed his eyes. His loyal bodyguard squeezed the trigger, and the body of the cult leader was obliterated by bullets. His dramatic death seemed fitting for such a dramatically evil man. Sara Aldrete and the remainder of the cult came quietly, and were all imprisoned for decades between them. The murder of Mark Kilroy remains one of the most appalling cases in the country's history. Despite this, the sheer togetherness that manifested in the community of Santa Fe was extremely heartwarming. On April 13th, a huge religious ceremony was organised to remember Mark at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. In a touching show of support, school children pinned yellow ribbons to the trees outside the church, the place where Mark had felt most safe and in touch with God. The faith shown by Jim and Helen Kilroy was nothing short of remarkable, and although losing a child brings a certain grief like no other, they forgave their son's killers. They even asked people to pray they could get to heaven. They hoped that Adolfo Constanzo and his following would apologise to Mark in heaven, and they knew their kind son would forgive them for their wrongdoing. While the media were quick to blame the shady world of narcotics for Mark's murder, the Kilroys were exceptionally empathetic, and even told President George Bush Sr. that behind every drug addict, there lies a victim who needs help. They set up the Mark Kilroy Foundation and worked closely with many non-profit communities to promote drug awareness and education. They set up summer camps through the foundation, with an average of 550 students attending annually. Even though he's gone, Mark's legacy lives on through the camp's various outdoor activities, intended to keep students busy and away from the temptations of drugs. Mark's goal was to become a doctor to improve people's health and well-being. It's safe to say that through the foundation named in his legacy, he has achieved his dream. That's it for this week's episode. Thank you for listening as always, and I hope you can join me for next week. I've been your host, Sophie Ray. Bye for now.